4, case studies. We'll go through a series of case studies here for each of the context classifications. We're going to start with SR-24, the Cedar Key Scrub State Reserve in Levy County, Florida. The case study limits here are shown in red on the map. So if you're doing a project here, you can pull it up, start looking at it in Google Earth. You can also look at it on a land use map. A land use map is going to tell you that it's coded as open space. If you look at the land use map for this area, the Google Earth image might not tell you that that's what it's coded as, but you can tell by looking at it in Google Earth that it's open space. The land use map tells you that as well. There will be a PowerPoint version of this presentation, and in the PowerPoint version where you see click here, you'll actually be able to go in and click on that and go through and explore this corridor more closely in Google Earth if you want to see it more closely and get an idea what it actually looks like in real time. For the purposes of this presentation, we have pulled images into the presentation so you don't have to click and go look at it. But if you want to do that in the PowerPoint version, you will be able to do so. When we look at our primary measures for this roadway, the building height, there are no buildings. Building placement, there are no buildings. Fronting uses, there are no buildings. Off-street parking, there's no off-street parking because there's no parking at all. We look at our roadway connectivity. There's no intersections. There's no blocks. There's no block length. So it's pretty clear when we go back and look at our primary measures that we're looking at something that's either going to be in a C1 or C2 condition. There's no fronting uses. So looking at our distinguishing characteristics, essentially this is going to steer us toward a C1 or a C2 condition. And looking at the land use map, a lot of times this is where it may be necessary to just, you have to find a way to find out exactly what's going on here, and we see that this is actually in a conservation area, so it is a C1 condition there. If it did not exist on that land use map as a conservation area, it could be agriculture or something like that. But looking at the distinguishing characteristics and looking at the land use map lets us know that we're looking at a C1 natural condition there. When we look at the secondary measures for the case study, we see that there is no allowed residential density, there's no allowed office retail density, there's no population there, there's no existing employment density. So again, that's all pointing us back toward a C1 condition as opposed to a C2 condition. For our next case study, we're looking at US 301 in Manatee County. You can see the case study limits here in red along US Highway 301. As usual, we'll start by looking at the aerial photograph. You can see the area outlined here, and here's an inset that shows it kind of blown up. We can see, just looking at this, the surrounding context appears to be agricultural. There's fields, there's forests, things like this. There's some development to the south, maybe an edge condition here, but it looks like we're pretty much into the agricultural location in this area here. So just looking at our distinguishing characteristics, this is making us think we're probably looking at something maybe in a C2 condition. So let's go a little further and see what we've got. Our land use map also confirms that we're dealing with an agricultural condition here. When we look at our measures for building height and placement and parking, there are very few buildings there, but what we see are one-story buildings. The buildings are detached, there's not a consistent pattern of setbacks, and there's really no fronting uses along this corridor. There is parking is off-street, but there's no consistent pattern to the off-street parking. It's residential parking around houses and things like that. Looking at roadway connectivity measures, we do have two intersections here. There's one kind of a small road there, and then an intersection up here. It comes out to be around 2 intersections per square mile. There's really no blocks to speak of, so our block perimeter here is non-applicable. If you think of the block length as the distance between this intersection and that intersection, we can get an average block length of around 8,600 feet. But as we said before, there's no blocks really, but our block length, at least in terms of the distance between intersections, would be an average of around 8,600 feet. When we drop all this into our primary measures matrix, we can see kind of how it's shaking out here. Looking at the distinguishing characteristics, sparsely settled lands may include agricultural land, grassland, woodlands, and wetlands. That certainly appears to be what we have in this condition. The land uses match up, the building heights match up, 1 to 2 stories, detached buildings with no consistent pattern of setbacks. There are no fronting uses. Notice some other areas are also lit up green, so let's take a little look at those and see what kinds of things that might be telling us. The building heights are consistent also with what you might find in a rural town or in a suburban residential setting. The fact that there's no fronting uses, well, that would also be true in a suburban residential, suburban commercial. The intersection densities and block perimeters would be consistent with a C3, a C commercial, and maybe a C3 suburban residential. However, even though these things do show up, when we actually go back again, we always start with the distinguishing characteristics. You can see that this is certainly not a place with large building footprints and large parking lots. It's not a place with mostly residential uses with large blocks and a disconnected or sparse roadway network. So in this condition, the distinguishing characteristics help us just call out the things that are really important in the matrix from these other items here. So we feel pretty comfortable in this condition calling this a C2 rural context classification. If we wanted to, we could also look at the secondary measures. We may want to see, for instance, is there a different future in line for this maybe at some point? So let's look and see what the zoning has been telling us. The allowed residential density in this area is 0.2 dwelling units per acre. The allowed office residential density is not applicable here. There isn't any. And the existing population density is less than 1. And the existing employment density is 0. So again, using all these measurements, the secondary measures are also pointing us back toward a C2 rural context classification for this case study.